Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening for some of us, I imagine. My name is Tunde Olatunji. I'm the Associate Director of Policy here at the Africa Center. And for those of you who have joined us for programs in the past, we're glad to have you back with us. And for those joining us for the first time, welcome. Before we begin, just a little bit about the Africa Center. We're a multidisciplinary institution concerned primarily with how the world sort of understands and engages with the continent of Africa and its diaspora. So to us, it's important not only what kinds of things inform our understanding of the place and its people, but also sort of who gets to shape that understanding matters as well. And so as part of that work, we put on public programs a few times a month, such as this one, which we developed essentially to try to sell you on the idea that some of these ideas that are sometimes abstract or distant seeming, we want to convince you that these things do matter to our daily lives and are worthy of our attention. And so today we're going to try to learn a bit more and get a bit smarter about Africa's public debt. And to help us do that, we're joined by two guests. Dr. Adedeji Adeniran, is the Director of Research at the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa in Abuja. His career has spanned over a decade, primarily in the fields of international development, fiscal policy, education, and the digital economy. His research focuses on how Africa can effectively leverage regional cooperation on issues such as development finance and debt towards more sustainable development outcomes. And we're also joined by Mr. George Bodo, who is the director at Call Street Research and Analytics in Nairobi. He works mainly on investment analysis in Sub-Saharan Africa. He has expertise in macroeconomics, consumer behavior, and the policy and regulatory environment, particularly in East Africa. He's also a frequent contributor to CNBC Africa on issues related to the banking sector in the region. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. And
thank you.
Great. Okay. So to get started, I'm sure we could have like a very expensive, sort of days-long conversation about the ins and outs of debt. But considering that we are having a policy discussion, I want to start by focusing us a bit and starting with you, Dr. Adeniran. And could I just ask you to explain briefly sort of how debt factors into development and state administration across Africa in general? Sort of what have we been borrowing for?
Okay, thanks, and thanks everyone. So like, I think it's not just inevitable in Africa, but I mean, every country in the world, debt is inevitable for government in terms of operating government activities and government institutions. And there are many reasons for this. One obvious reason is the fact that the flows of revenue and expenditure doesn't match one another. So for instance, I mean, the expectation about revenue and expenditure doesn't come at the same time. So for that reason, governments do borrow. But that's actually not the major reason why we have debts or huge debt portfolio on the continent. I think two reasons that actually have accounted for a huge debt on the continent is, number one, the enormous development needs of the continent. When you compare that to tax capacity, then you find that the need to borrow. For example, UNCTAD estimated that for Africa to achieve XDGs, countries on the continent will have to spend about $600 billion per annum. If you add up all what government is making in terms of tax revenue, that adds up to around $500 billion. That's giving you around 100 billion of deficit per annum in terms of developmental spending. But even take into consideration that not all tax revenue goes into implementation of XDGs. There are many other things that government needs to do. So the size is so small compared to our developmental needs. So for that reason, government needs to borrow, because you can't use tax alone to really do it, because I mean the size capacity of the economy in some instances is an issue. the tax base is not wide enough, and so the distortionary effect of taxes on the economy and then the people can be huge. So you want to spread it over time, and debt is like a tool that can enable you to spread this kind of burden over time. So that's another reason. Another reason I think debt is quite an age issue is the economic shock and uncertainty. For example, COVID-19. It represents an example of economic shock, but it's not the only one. Global financial problem and other. During COVID-19, it was estimated that African countries actually borrowed 4.5% higher than they ought to have borrowed, due to just reason that can be explained by the COVID-19 threat. So given the problem that actually comes with economic shocks, it leads to recession, job loss, increase in poverty. You want to avoid that. So what you do is you can actually have to cushion the effect. So during bad time, economies or countries need to borrow in order to sustain it. The problem in African sense has always been the fact that during good time, we borrow, during bad time, we borrow. And that's actually one of the sources of the problem on the continent.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so the idea essentially, it's the amount we have, the amount the government is able to call on for all their spending. The amount that's coming in is not equivalent to how much that needs to go out, and so it necessitates that the capital required comes from elsewhere. That makes sense. And so I want to go into this idea of internal versus external debt. I want to come to you, Mr. Bodo, and unfortunately, Mr. Bodo is having some technical trouble, so we've asked him to turn off his camera in the meantime, so we don't lose him. But Mr. Bodo, could you please briefly just explain to us the difference between our country's external debt stock versus domestic?
Okay, so sorry. So thank you, Tunde. So broadly, the difference between external and domestic is external is owed in other people's currency, and most of the external currency, if you look across the debt books in Sub-Saharan Africa, you'll find it leaning more toward the US dollar. So that explains external, basically borrowing someone else's currency.
Someone else's currency versus holding the debt in your own currency. That makes sense.
Yes,
and I think you
domestic is your own currency, the one you printed.
got you. And you sort of you alluded to this in your answer, but I wanted, so who generally are the holders of Africa's external debts? Like, I know it's not the same across all countries, but on average, who would you say are the sort of usual suspects as far as who Africa's debt is owed to?
Yeah, so there are a couple of holders. I think if you look at most debt books in the region, the largest holder is multilateral agencies. So you have the World Bank, International Development Agency, you have the IMF, the Bretton Woods, and then you have also the other multilateral agencies that are less known, like we have more. Well, they're not really less known. We've got names like Afreximbank names coming up strongly. Away from the multilateral, you have the unilateral, the bilateral debt, which is country-to-country debt. Usually they're very concessionary. They have very prolonged moratorium. And the interest rate is very low. I think, like for instance, in East Africa, countries in East Africa are paying anything between 2 to 3% on bilateral debt. That's on dollar. And then, of course, for the countries that have tapped in the international debt market, then you come across. Oh, so let me add on the bilateral. Another emerging player over the last 10 years is China. China seems to have taken most of the countries. Although Chinese loans are very expensive, actually. Like for instance, Kenya is paying about 8 to 9% on the dollar for Chinese debt, and the total debt outstanding is just about or $7 billion. That's quite significant. I mean, if you go to countries like it's replicated across board, you go to Ethiopia, you go to Zambia, even Nigeria, you'll find there's a huge presence of Chinese money, the debt books. And then apart from the bilaterals and the multilaterals, we will have the commercial financiers. You have Eurobond holders. So this is for countries who have tapped into the international debt market. You'll always find Eurobond holders. And then also you have some bank debt.
Some commercial bank that is as well.
Especially the syndications. Some countries, when the international debt market is not favorable, they go for syndications. So you find a syndicate of 2 or 3 banks advance the country some debt. That's how the profile of the debt book looks like generally.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have a fair bit of it being owed to multilateral aid agencies of the sort. They're a bit owed to high-income countries. And let me come back to you, Dr. Adeniran, kind of staying on this point. It would seem that traditionally Africa's debt has been owed to some fairly official institutional type lenders, right? High-income countries in Europe and North America, some multilaterals. But it seems today that it's becoming increasingly less the case, and you're finding that private lenders and bond holders of the sort are making up a larger proportion of Africa's debt stock. So does that matter who our debt is owed to and why? I think Mr. Bodo alluded to sort of concessionary loan versus not, but could you expand on why it matters who you're paying these debts back to?
Okay, I mean, I think it matters a lot. It matters a lot. And I think the first reason why it matters might be the fact that the interest payments, which you talk about, concessionary loan has very little interest payment. But again, we know low-income countries benefit more from that than middle-income countries. So with the Chinese loan, private sector loans, you see actually that the interest rate is quite high compared to these loans or debts that you owe to multilateral. So it matters because, I mean, when you talk about debt servicing and debt repayment, that's adds up in a way. And also, the long-term nature of the debt so also matters from these different people. But I think one key difference between these different actors is in terms of control and ownership. What I mean by that is the fact that the sectoral allocation of debt. In most cases, in many of what we see, for example, some of this multilateral debt is restricted to sectors you have to actually spend on. For example, most of it actually goes into social assistance, human capital development, and the rest. Most of this might not actually be targeted towards investment in infrastructure. But you see private sector, I mean, it's more kind of relaxed kind of settings, such that you see a lot of this allocation going into a lot of infrastructural development and the rest. But also, I think you need to see the motive also is a difference in these settings. So the motive for different ages, for example, private sector, the private profit motive has always been the case, but also you see some, we are seeing some agents that I imagine on that deficit that their interest is about other than that, I mean, they are looking to, so for example, you see countries borrowing you money to do road. Why are they borrowing money to do road? For instance, maybe they have access to a mining area, and the road to that place, to the port is very bad. You're able to access loan in order to actually do road construction. So you can see it also have that kind of investment motive, giving you money to develop. So we see, for example, for Chinese loan, you see example of a lot of that investment is into extractive sector, infrastructure development, then in a way it has a kind of bilateral gains or profits in that sense. So it has a lot of things, but also it also matters for transparency. Some of these agents, multilateral, you have to actually adhere to a lot of regulations, reporting, accountability framework. In some of these other agencies, the restriction is actually quite less, and that has implication in terms of country willingness on which one to take. So, the kind of control ownership you have, the kind of interest payment, the motive, ideas around debt transparency. I think all of this differentiates these different actors together. So in a way, it then gives countries ability to see differences and also to go for which one actually match their interests. And I think it's a good thing when we have multiplicity of actors in this space. I think it allows countries to actually choose in many ways, and that actually is good for African countries. Thank you.
So the sort of the difference in their profiles gives the borrowing countries the ability to go in and say, okay, what features of what lenders is most suitable for the situation I find myself in? What kinds of reporting requirements are more convenient for circumstances? So I understand the benefits to the borrowers in that sense. And just before we go into another set of questions I want to ask, I want to stick on this a bit and ask, you mentioned the use on infrastructure projects and sort of funding just the state in general. And do you have a sense of how much of the money that's being borrowed is actually productive, right? How much of it is going towards these more revenue generating enterprises versus, say, paying salaries of government employees? Is that, do we have a clear sense, or is that still part of this that's not transparent enough?
Oh, okay, so thanks. I think in more recent times, and actually especially after the EPICS, the debt relief initiatives in the year 2000, we've seen a lot of more transparency and a lot of linking debts to specific kind of infrastructural development and projects. So for example, look at Sukuk bond that a lot of countries actually have taken. So is directly targeted to infrastructure. And so in many ways, in terms of aid transparency and those frameworks, so we are seeing more kind of aid going to what countries actually promise to use this for. However, there are also, issues and challenges around that. I can give you an example of Nigeria. If you look at the debt servicing to revenue ratio, it's more than 100%, which means most of your debt is actually not even enough for you to repay back this debt servicing. So most of the revenue. So what it means for a country is you are definitely borrowed to pay back some debt servicing. If you look at also at the local level, or what the country is making, you would see that there are usually some debt that are also going into obviously salaries payment. We also have this issue of subsidies. Government subsidizing a lot. So some of those goes into those inefficient activities like paying for salaries. But in my estimation, our country actually work around some of these things. So for example, some of mostly domestic debt in countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, that have very good domestic debt markets. They could borrow in, and maybe those ones actually go into those kind of, but most of this external debt, in some cases, it's not even the corruption, it's not even the inefficiency, it's about government betting on some risky project or putting their hope in some huge infrastructure development. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So it's not about the corruption
Right.
in terms of how we are spending.
Yeah, sometimes the decisions are just not the right one. But you're saying, as a way to get around this, lenders are then now sort of attaching specific requirements to the debt and saying, this is money you're being lent to do X specifically, right? And you have to allocate it to spending on that. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I think that's a I have a good sense of the overview of sort of how debt works on the continent. And to come back to you, Mr. Bodo, just to bring this back into practice again, and it would seem that a lot of these interactions are happening on sort of the macro institutional level. And I'm wondering how, if at all, these issues translate into daily life as a person living in a country that's trying to service debt, right? Say I'm a person in Ghana, I'm just trying to run my small business and make a living for myself and my family. Why should I care about this in my daily life?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question. You should, as a person living in Nigeria or Ghana, you should, because these things show up in the books, government books. So, like for instance, in Kenya, the debt service ratio is 50%. Total public debt service is 50%. But that means that every dollar that the equivalent dollar that the government mobilizes in terms of taxes, half of it goes in debt service. That constrains the government's ability to fund other critical programs, especially the development, because most African governments, wages and salaries gobble up most of the tax. And so it's very important. So you find, like for instance, in Kenya, the government has this idea that if they tax more, they can be able to service the debt. And that's where the problem is. Now you find taxation levels are very high, even on very basic things. You find the tax is just unbearable for ordinary people. Like for instance, in most of East Africa, I give a good example, is the petroleum products, the palm products, between 50 to 60% of the price of the palm price is tax. So you find that you're just funding government all the time. So and this is why these things are very critical. And then if you leave even the palm prices, you go to even just the basics like bread, milk. The prices have gone up because government just thinks that they can tax their way out of debt service, which is the wrong approach. So you find, on average, prices keep going up. Like prices of basic things, like for instance, cooking oil, toiletries, they're more than doubled, and biggest driver is tax.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
because the government has this ability, that has this thinking that they have no cap to their spending, and there's no cap to the extent they can tax you.
right.
So they think that sustainability, achieving debt sustainability is actually on the revenue side, but the actual problem is expenditure, and that there's some lots of phantom projects that these debts have gone into that are just not productive.
Okay, so that makes sense. So if that matters in my life, if the government is having to spend less on, say, schools or hospitals or roads because they're servicing debt, that's a way that I can see debt in my life. If the government is having to tax me a lot more than they would because they're having to service debt, that is that affecting my life. Okay.
And another example is Ghana. I mean, look at what's going on in Ghana, especially to pensioners. The government has had this domestic debt, what do they call it? Domestic debt exchange program, where debt holders basically were asked to take a haircut on the debt to support government efforts to bring back stability in public finances. But you can imagine, I mean, pensioners, if you're taking a haircut on your fixed If you're living on fixed income as a pensioner, that's a big disruption to finances.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think I would say I'm sold on the fact that this is an important topic to pay attention to. And Dr. Adeniran, let me come to you. What would you say if I then said though that okay, I acknowledge that this is important, and I'm from a country where government has, I'll say there are plenty more sort of fundamental services that government can stand to provide more consistently. Why should debt owed to other countries be a priority, right? I understand it's important, but a lot of things are important, right? In these sort of developing circumstances. So can you make the case why this should be a priority?
So debt hold to other countries, why should it be a priority? I don't think it should be a priority, but it depends on circumstances, and I will give you 2 instances. So for example, I can give you an example of Nigeria. What happened after the debt relief initiative in 2006 is the fact that the country actually developed its own capital market and domestic debt market, such that the country government at every level can go into the market and also borrow. And you see that kind of an element of economic progress. And that actually helps in a way that you see as at around 2020 and 2019, about 70% of the debt is actually domestic debt, and just 30% is external debt. But the fact is, things begin to change because there is also a problem with that. If you look at the interest rate of domestic debt, at that period is around 14%. Whereas you can actually go for external debt that is between 5 and 6%. So government actually then had a deliberate policy to restructure a debt such that they take on even more foreign debt, using it to pay back some of the domestic debt in order to rebalance it. So in a way, it's about which one gives you the lowest interest rate. So you go for the one that actually are going to give you the lowest interest. So, but okay. The problem in some instances is the fact that if you look and link this to debt sustainability, one of the problem in debt crisis is the when you hold other people's currencies, because in that sense you need to actually have a good trade portfolio in order for you to repay back, because that's how you earn dollars, and that's how you can repay back the debt. So if you have bad trade outcomes, that could affect your ability to repay back the debt. So in that instance, you see that I think it's appropriate for countries to balance both domestic and external debt. But more importantly, I think countries should look at what is the size of and how developed is their domestic debt market. If you don't have a well-developed domestic market, so you go into external debt, how do you need to do it? I think you just need to be more, I mean, you need it, but you have to be moderate in it, because in sense, when you begin to see higher, non-sustainable debt, for example, according to IMF, that rate for Africa is around 55%, but you see already more than 10 African countries are already exceeding that. So that's a major issue. But you're also seeing a period like we had of economic turmoil, whereby things were not, so there's the one incentive to spend a lot of money. But I think the reality is the fact that given the revenue circumstances, is about how do we actually borrow in a way that what we go for would be for capital infrastructure, and those capital infrastructure should be those that are productive, linked to a very viable market that can support economic growth, that can also support kind of raise revenue for the country. If that's the target of those borrowing, then it makes sense. But if you can, if you don't do your math very well, if you don't understand the linkage between various arms of the economy, you can borrow for road, and at the end it doesn't actually, it's a big gamble that doesn't actually yield that result. So those are kind of, I think, economics the country needs to actually add up the numbers in terms of what do they need to do.
What do they need to do? Oh, no, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I want to be mindful of time. And if anyone has any questions, please start thinking about them. We have about 10 more minutes of conversation, and then we'd love to get some of your questions. Before we,
a point to that.
yeah, of course.
So I mean, he's right. I mean, and my co-panelist is right on that front. The issue of what's the point? The domestic debt generally is very expensive, by the way, contrary to most views, in terms of interest payments. So, like for instance, I was looking at the numbers for Kenya. We're paying for on the domestic debt. We're paying for 4 times. Even though if you look the split between external and domestic debt is half-half, but the interest payments on the domestic is 4 times what they're paying on the external debt. I looked at Ghana, it's almost 8 times. So domestic debt tends to be very expensive. I think the figure even for Nigeria must be very high. And this is also because of the interest rate curve, which is what is talking about very strong domestic market that can provide a smoothing mechanism to the interest rate environment. In Kenya, they're even thinking of borrowing concessional debt to repay all the domestic debt because they realize it's very expensive. However, also, again, as I said, you have to be careful. We're owing debt in other people's currency. You better have, the economy must be very strong in generating the same foreign currency.
Same.
Otherwise, it will be a problem. But I don't know what's happening. I mean, sometimes it's very interesting. You look at countries like Ghana, they have resources they can sell to the world, but they still suffer from problems, foreign currency. I mean, look at the oil producing countries. They still have, everybody still runs the IMF for balance of payment support, which is something which I find to be a bit puzzling.
Just on that, sorry, pardon me. Sorry, go ahead. I just had a follow-up point on this idea of foreign debt and the idea how the ideas of sovereignty kind of fits into that. And I have a question specifically about your neck of the woods in Kenya about that. But before that, I want to ask you, Dr. Adeniran, about this idea when you talk about money owed to foreign countries and particularly countries in Europe and North America. It's difficult to disentangle that conversation from a legacy of colonialism and not wanting to repeat those sorts of dynamics that have existed both politically, economically, and culturally. And I wonder, how do you think that debt owed to these world powers would complicate any efforts by Africa to kind of carve out a more self-determined future for itself, right? Be it economically or geopolitically. Can you do that well and cleanly while also owing billions of dollars to the people that you're trying to, in essence, divorce from?
Okay, I think so. On that front, I would think there has been a kind of leap in terms of we've actually developed. We are more. I mean, our debts landscape is more delinked from the colonial imperialist kind of narrative. And I can give you 3 reasons for that. I mean, we've mentioned already that the creditors pool is more diversified than before. So we have all sorts of things. We have China that's doesn't have a colony, but actually also see in terms of interaction with other global southers what is called South-South cooperation rather than North-South kind of. So taking each other as co-equal. We also see a lot of private sector entry, but even among the Western or multilateral agencies, I mean, that idea of Washington consensus, I think is weaker than before now. I mean, then in the 90s, the development paradigm is more linked towards economic growth. Now we are in the era of SDG, MDGs, and I think the agenda is more poverty reduction. And so that has been the central theme, and that has helped and advanced the position of African countries. But having said that, I think there is still a problem. I think the reality of what some scholars describe as debt trap diplomacy, I think is real. If you are owing some countries, I think even if you cannot pay back, country has leverage on other part of the country. I mean, we've seen in some instances voting even at the United Nations, even having access to some of this borrowing or some of this market to even borrow. It has a lot of diplomacy. And in some instances, it's about tit for tat in some areas whereby countries have to actually maybe vote for them or restrict access to other people or other countries or draw down on other relationship with other parts of the world. I think it's a major issue. And another issue that we are also seeing is the fact that especially with debt among global southern countries, we are also seeing the fact that it is not just linked, it's linked to trade, it links to other economic relationships. And that has a way of not enabling you to actually also develop concretely on your own aspect of, I mean, what you need to develop. I give you an example of countries whereby they are, for example, if you look at Chinese law, for instance, you find that even their development corporation, you see that it's going mostly into extractive industries. Why? Because China also is interested in African extractive industries. So you could see that could be exploratory in some. And it's not just China in many ways. So it happens in diplomacy. It happens whereby we cannot really find, delineate or separate between those kind of relationships from our own development, such that we can actually be taking decisions that are contrary or even not supportive of our own economic development in that aspect.
So exactly, I think that is kind of the point I wanted us to focus on. This idea, I'm willing to accept that a lot of the debt is being put towards well-meaning, well-intentioned things, but I do think it's important who is driving the direction of these things. And let me come to you, Ms. Bodo. I know President Russo, in your neck of the woods in Kenya, he has made sort of changing the country's borrowing practices as one of the foundations of his administration, and changing the way that we borrow. And one of the problems, he says, is that money is being put towards spending that is not necessary. And one of the proposed things I read when he was on the campaign during the elections last year was that the provision of schools and sort of mission hospitals and those kinds of things can be done by philanthropies, right? People who may have more experience in this space. And while that makes sense to me, right? That's less spending for government. But I think there's also this question of sovereignty that comes into that, right? Who is running these philanthropies, and do those people have an outsized impact on the country's development in general? I wonder, what do you think these kinds of concessions are the way to go in terms of like fixing our debt servicing obligations on the continent?
No, that's not the way to go. Just to answer your question, he's changing the debt, the borrowing approach. He's now looking away from China, which his predecessor did heavily. He's now leaning more towards the West. I mean, during the US-Africa Forum, I think that was in January, he was able to meet a few creditors in Washington, and even met with the American government. I think he's more likely looking at resuscitating the relationship with rather taking advantage of the fact that the US and most of the Western powers are trying now hard to dislodge China from the African debt, the African market. So he's trying to jump on that trade. So that's the big change that he's doing. The other question about philanthropies, I think philanthropies have a different agenda. One of the biggest philanthropists in this country is Bill and Melinda Gates, funding a lot of programs. But they also have, I don't think they're very clean in their agenda sometimes. I find like they use it to drive other peripheral goals. Like for instance, Bill, what's his name? Bill Gates was here a couple of months back, urging the governments to adopt genetically modified crops as a way of solving the food situation. And it's a very hot topic.
Yes.
It's a very hot topic on this side of the world.
Controversial, to say the least.
It's very controversial.
Yeah. So I at least I'm glad to hear at the very least he's abandoning, at least he seems to be pivoting away from that approach to servicing debt. Dr. Adeniran, before we take some of the audience questions, there's another approach that I've seen has been floated by lenders for debt relief has been this idea of debt swaps for climate change targets. And I wonder, could you just please briefly explain what debt swaps are, and anything that ends with for climate change sounds like a good thing to me. And could you clarify why, if at all, that should give us pause?
Okay, the idea of debt for climate swaps emerged after, during COVID-19, where countries, debt emerged as a major constraint, restricting country from spending. And that actually has a way of actually setting back a number of what we have achieved on the development front. For example, it's estimated that poverty alone, we have had a setback of up to 4 years. So the implication of what we are saying is, if you look at the MDGs and what happens and why Africa was able to achieve a lot, it's because of debt relief initiatives that enable countries to actually free up fiscal space and enable them to spend on development priorities. And you see a lot of progress. Of course, we are unable to achieve most of the goals, but we're able to also move forward. Now with SDGs and its priority on climate change and the rest, you find that for climate change, most of the cost is not from Africa. So in terms of what can we do, in terms of our behavioral change, there's limit to it because we are not the cause. However, based on global arrangements, is that the Western countries would support transition in Africa, but those commitments has not been carried out effectively. So the question is, if we really desire about climate change, debt is one thing, instrument to look at. Instead of actually asking for debt repayment, can we also look at using that for debt financing? I think there are both pros and cons in all of this, but I think there is a very good argument to be made that part of financing option for climate change in Africa might have to come from debt relief initiative. How this should go will depend based on negotiation, but I think that can free up some kind of funding and financing instruments for climate change. And I think we've learned lessons a lot from epic era, whereby debt relief was able to actually enable countries to push forward on education, on health goals, on poverty reduction. And I think similar agenda, so there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from that it's visible. So we can use it as an agenda to transit country. And in a way, it can be back and forth. Western countries have made commitment to these countries about what we do, and they are failing their commitment. So there could be another instrument to look into to see what we can do to enable us to support it. But like I said, there are pros and cons to this. It will involve kind of negotiation in terms of what should we do. But it's something that should be on the table.
Absolutely, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I think my pause will always just come with the idea. I will always keep harping on the idea of who gets to drive the agenda. I think if Africa has a climate change agenda, it should be able to develop that itself as opposed to sort of being nudged into it with the risk of debt payments, but that might be a overly simplistic take. I want to go to some questions from the audience because I think I've also had a similar question. To me, I I would think, okay, there is some risk of reputational damage associated with having like a poor debt rating, right? Or just or defaulting on your debt. But aside from like bad press and maybe some short-term embarrassment, what's the big deal? It seems there's a risk to defaulting on debt that's not just social, right? Can you explain why it is bad for African countries to have poor debt ratings? I want to go to you, Mr. Bodo, really quickly. I want to see if we can get a couple of questions in.
Oh, sorry, what's the question?
The question was about what is the effect of African countries sort of having these not great debt ratings and what that means for their ability to exist in a global environment.
And by now, by the most of African sovereigns are rated junk. I think recently they downgraded Nigeria to junk. The net effect is that any country going to the international debt market will pay a premium. They will have to pay a premium because now they're considered to be high risk.
Because now they're high risk. Now that say we're in a situation where we accept, okay, Africa, a lot of African countries are in this situation. What is the way out? Not to overly simplify this, but how do you avoid this? Because this seems like a trap in essence, right? You can't really get out of it if you're stuck, if you can't get cheap debt because you're already a bad borrower.
The solution is to restore order in public finances. That means is trying to consolidate your fiscal consolidation, trying to rationalize expenditure, basically trying to narrow the gap between your revenues and the expenditure to a point where either they can match, we have a surplus, we have a small deficit. The problem is that most African countries are running very, very wide deficit, fiscal deficit. So the solution ultimately is to restore order in public finances.
So it's
and then you'd see your ratings going up, because the ratings guys usually don't take them very seriously anyway. They say that you there's a mismatch between your expenditure and revenues, and that will jeopardize your ability to
your recommendation would be for just greater fiscal discipline, which I think is never a bad thing. I want to get one more question in if we can, and this is for you, Dr. Adeniran. It's this, we've mentioned this a few times, but this idea of debt traps that African countries are falling in. The money owed to this idea of a Chinese debt trap. I think China accounts for 12% of Africa's total debt, which is not significantly higher than any other bilateral debt that we have. Could you just briefly explain to us whether this is really propaganda, this idea of staring away from China? To what extent are the risks overblown versus true? And how do Chinese lending practices differ from, say, Japan or the US?
Okay, so I think I think there are two parts to it. I think China coming into that space is good for Africa because it makes more actors, and that competition among creditors enable, for example, you see most of the multilaterals, they also coming and rethinking issues around financing infrastructure. Which Africa actually prioritize, but development institutions most times don't prioritize such. So in a way, it's good. But I also think, so for example, there's a study, there is a study that shows that African debt to Africa, Chinese debt to Africa, it's about 50% of this is hidden debt, which brings the issue of transparency. So one of the things that I think we gained from EPIC is the fact that we develop what an autonomous debt management institutions. And that enables us to actually improve transparency and capacity in debt management, and which was crucial in managing debt portfolio in Africa. But I think also with the hidden debts, which some have been accused of China debt stuff, I think it's also weakened that aspect. So you see a lot of country then going back on that kind of very noble accountability framework that could have supported in many ways. So that's one of the problems. And also, I think one other problem I have seen in that space is coordination. So donors are not coordinating amongst them. I mean, creditors, they are not coordinating among themselves in order to actually ask the question, should we borrow this country? So with the hidden debt phenomenon, you could actually be overborrowing countries that has no capacity to repay back. So that actually can worsen the debt crisis within the within countries. So I think coordination in that end would help. And I think given that China until recently has not been part of that, that has weakened their position. And the bilateral kind of conversation and the link of some of the development to instances of trade, and I think that in itself weakens countries' position. But I want to say it's about balance of it. It's good in terms of a new actor, but I think there are some progress that we've made that these new actors must not weaken on the continent, especially in the area of good governance, accountability framework that are crucial to fiscal management. Because if we actually have debt crisis, it's not just on the debtors. I mean, it's on the country in a way. I mean, so it affects us in many ways. So it's responsible for also the creditors to also be responsible in terms of doing and playing
borrowing as well.
Good ethics.
Thank you. That's both you, Dr. Adeniran and Mr. Bodo. Thank you very, very much. It's been very helpful. We have a lot more questions, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but I'm sure you can connect with the speakers after. They'll be happy to answer your question. If we could just leave on one more question for you both, just to tie this back to why we're doing this at all. Say I'm a person that left this webinar, I went home and I'm all of a sudden very concerned about my country's debt. I'm stressed out, sleepless nights about it. What avenues exist for me as a citizen of an African country concerned with my government's debt, with my country's public debt? What avenues exist for me to affect this situation, right? Because we just had elections in Nigeria. I promise you that did not come up at any campaign stop or any rally. No one's shouting, well, what is your plan for debt? So how do we have agency in this? And this will be both of you. Let's start with you, Mr. Adeniran.
Okay, I mean, in terms of agencies for public, I think it's kind of one of the discussion about debt is wrapped around the package of economic growth, economic sustainability, and everything, public financial investment. But it is until it becomes a crisis that debt in itself becomes a priority issue in terms of policy discussion. So I think there's a role, I think that agency needs to be taken by African institutions, especially think tanks and civil society, in order to actually separate that argument so that we don't actually bring everything together until we enter into a crisis situation. So certain priorities, I think that has to be a role for African institutions. And what they could do is actually to see and to discuss and to get the buy-in of the public through surveys, through opinions, such that public priority can be conveyed effectively to the government. I think that's one area that we could do it, but also to sound alarms before it gets into crisis. So most times, I mean, there's a number of economic indicators that citizens are monitoring every day. So I mean, there are a lot of things that you are worried than government debt until it becomes a crisis situation. So I think centers, think tanks, civil societies, they need to actually ask and communicate the problem to this public so the public can actually have that and they can join the conversation in many ways through voicing the opinion. I mean, there have been a lot of debt issues in Africa that were actually asked to be a referendum. Should we take it or not? So it's based on that. I mean, I remember in 1987, some of these actually were there was a referendum about what should we do it or not. So for us to have this kind of conversation now today, I think someone needs to actually take it there to tell the public the truth about the problems, the issues, and what we need to do. I think that conversation will help in that way. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And Mr. Bodo, last word, please.
I think it speaks to what I call civic competence. Ultimately, these decisions are made by politicians. We give politicians the driving seat in deciding a lot of these things. How do those politicians get there? It's the citizens who vote them. So when I look at, like, for instance, this side of the world, in Kenya, we voted people who didn't even have a plan, who didn't even give us a plan on how they're going to manage the public debt or how they're going to restore fiscal discipline. That's not conversation that was part of campaign. So I think eventually, if politics going get into issue based, we'll have a lot of these things sorted. The problem is you're still very far from that. People still vote based on being dished out with money.
Thank you. Well, on that somewhat sad note, I think we could end and just say, I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone on this call right now that there are challenges still in many African countries with respect to governance, but I think it's also important to note I think quite commendable progress that has been made on many fronts. So while we will continue to try to hold them accountable, we can at the same time point out the things that need fixing. Mr. Bodo and Mr. Adeniran, thank you so much for joining us. For everyone still on the call, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to follow at the Africa Center on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all those good things. And you can find both Mr. Bodo and Mr. Adeniran on LinkedIn and Twitter, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you very much, and we have a lot of these coming up in the next few weeks, and we hope to see you at those ones as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day. Have a good day.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us, the ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.